December 16th, 1944, 5:24 a.m. In 6 minutes, the largest artillery barrage on the Western Front since D-Day will begin. In 6 hours, more than 200,000 German soldiers will be driving deep into Allied lines in what will become the largest battle ever fought by the United States Army. But right now, in the darkness before dawn, the Ardennes Forest is silent. American soldiers sleep in their foxholes, wrapped in thin blankets against temperatures that have dropped to 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Most believe the war is nearly over. Adolf Hitler is finished, they tell themselves. Germany is beaten. Christmas will come in 9 days, and some of these men dare to hope they might see the new year at home. They are catastrophically, terrifyingly wrong. What these soldiers don't know, what their commanders don't know, what even the legendary code breakers at Bletchley Park who have been reading German secrets for 3 years don't know, is that hidden in the forest directly in front of them, close enough that some American sentries can hear the faint sounds of engines idling and men whispering, sits the largest concentration of German military power assembled since the Normandy invasion. 3 entire armies. Estimates suggest nearly 1,000 tanks and assault guns, 1,600 artillery pieces positioned wheel to wheel, all waiting in absolute radio silence for the order to attack. The intelligence failure is almost complete. The surprise will be total, and in a few hours, American forces will face what appears to be certain annihilation. But here's what makes this story remarkable. And here's what German commanders won't discover until it's too late. They've already lost. Not because of American firepower, not because of superior numbers. They've lost because of decisions made weeks before this moment, decisions that seemed minor at the time, but will prove decisive. A colonel's intelligence briefing that one general actually listened to. A contingency plan drawn up just in case. A single decision to position 2 divisions where they could respond to a crisis. These small choices, made in November and early December by men who didn't know they were setting the stage for the largest battle in American history, will determine everything. This is the story of how the United States Army, caught entirely off guard, surrounded, outnumbered, and fighting in some of the worst conditions imaginable, stopped Adolf Hitler's last desperate gamble. This is the story of soldiers who had every reason to surrender, but refused. This is the story of a siege where defenders replied to a surrender demand with a single word that would echo through history. This is the story of how winter itself became a weapon, how weather changed the course of a battle, and how small decisions made in quiet offices would prove more important than courage on the battlefield. This is the Battle of the Bulge, and by the end you'll understand that it was won before the first shot was ever fired, though no one realized it at the time. To understand how the American army found itself on the edge of catastrophe that December morning, we need to step back 6 months to the beaches of Normandy and the long, brutal road that led both armies to this frozen forest. Because the story of the Battle of the Bulge doesn't begin with the first artillery shell on December 16th. It begins with a victory that seemed so complete, so final, that it blinded the Allies to what was still possible. The young American soldiers in the Ardennes that morning represented a cross-section of the nation at war. Some belonged to veteran divisions like the 2nd and 28th Infantry, units that had fought their way across France and through the nightmare of the Ardennes Forest. Others were members of newly arrived divisions, the 99th and 106th, filled with replacement troops who had yet to see serious combat. They occupied villages with Belgian names that would soon become legendary: Bastogne, Saint-Vith, Malmedy, Echternach. They warmed themselves by small fires, wrote letters home, and perhaps allowed themselves to hope that they might see Christmas with their families. The landscape itself seemed to offer protection. The Ardennes is not easy terrain for military operations. Dense forests cover steep hills. Roads are narrow and winding. Rivers cut through valleys that become natural defensive barriers. The Germans had proven in 1940 that armor could pass through the Ardennes, but that seemed like a different war, a different world. Surely, the Allied commanders reasoned, the Germans would not attempt such a maneuver again. Surely they lacked the resources, the fuel, the manpower. This was December 1944. Germany was being squeezed from east and west. Soviet forces were pushing toward Berlin. American and British armies stood at the Rhine. The end seemed inevitable. Yet Hitler had other plans. Based on records of his briefings to commanders and his strategic directives, Hitler believed one decisive blow could change everything. His strategic calculation, as articulated to his generals, was that if German forces could break through the Allied lines, race to the port of Antwerp, and cut off British and American armies in the north, the Western Allies might be forced to negotiate. At the very least, such a victory would buy time to redirect German forces to the Eastern Front, where the Soviet juggernaut threatened the heart of the Reich. It was a desperate gamble, born of Germany's deteriorating strategic position, but Hitler had built his career on such audacious risks. As the sky began to lighten on that December morning, an eerie quiet settled over the forest. American sentries stamped their feet against the cold and scanned the tree line. In command posts, officers pored over maps and intelligence reports. The reports showed enemy movements, concentrations of forces, but nothing that suggested an imminent attack. The prevailing wisdom at Allied headquarters was that Germany was finished, that any offensive capability had been destroyed in the summer campaigns. General Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, had his attention focused elsewhere on the upcoming Allied offensives planned for after Christmas. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, had chosen to thin out the Ardennes sector precisely because he believed nothing of consequence could happen there. But at 5:30 in the morning, as dawn broke over the snow-covered hills, the illusion shattered. The German artillery opened fire. For 90 minutes, 1,600 guns roared along an 80-mile front. The barrage was unlike anything the Americans in this sector had experienced. Shells screamed through the air, exploding among the trees, in the villages, on the roads. The earth itself seemed to shake. In foxholes and bunkers, American soldiers pressed themselves against the frozen ground, ears ringing, hearts pounding, as the world erupted around them. Then came the infantry and the tanks. Out of the mist and snow, German forces emerged. These were not the demoralized, poorly equipped troops the Allies had been facing in recent weeks. These were among Germany's best remaining units. SS Panzer divisions, parachute regiments, elite formations that had been held in reserve for this moment. They advanced with determination, with tactical skill, with a ferocity that caught the Americans off guard. Within hours, the entire character of the front changed. Units that had expected a quiet day found themselves in desperate combat. Radio networks crackled with confused reports. German paratroopers had dropped behind American lines. German soldiers wearing American uniforms were spreading confusion. Tanks were breaking through. The line was buckling. In some places, American units fought stubbornly, trading their lives for time. In others, surrounded and overwhelmed, soldiers had no choice but to surrender. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. This battle would become the largest single engagement fought by the United States Army in World War II. Before it ended 6 weeks later, more than 1 million Allied soldiers would be involved, with American forces suffering approximately 19,000 killed, 47,500 wounded, and 23,000 missing or captured. The Germans would sustain between 80,000 and 100,000 casualties, and would lose their last strategic reserves. The battle would be fought in some of the worst weather conditions of the war, with temperatures dropping below 0 Fahrenheit and snow falling in blizzards that turned the battlefield into a frozen hell. But on that morning of December 16, 1944, no one could foresee the full scope of what was to come. They knew only that they were under attack, that the quiet sector was quiet no more, and that they would have to fight for their lives in the snow and the cold and the chaos of a battle that would decide the fate of nations. The long road to the Ardennes. Context and background. To understand how the Battle of the Bulge came to be, we must step back and trace the path that led both sides to that fateful December morning. The story begins, in many ways, on the beaches of Normandy 6 months earlier. Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of France, commenced on June 6, 1944. It was the largest amphibious operation in history, a massive undertaking that had required years of planning and preparation. American, British, and Canadian forces stormed 5 beaches along the Normandy coast, facing fierce German resistance, but ultimately establishing a foothold on the European continent. The battle for Normandy continued through the summer, a grinding campaign of hedgerow fighting that tested the determination and skill of both sides. By the end of July, Allied forces achieved a breakthrough. General George Patton's Third Army broke out from the Normandy lodgment and raced across France. Paris was liberated on August 25, 1944, to scenes of jubilation. The German army in France, which had fought so stubbornly, suddenly found itself in retreat. Some units maintained cohesion and conducted fighting withdrawals. Others disintegrated, with soldiers abandoning their equipment and fleeing toward the German border. The Allied advance was breathtaking in its speed. Towns and cities that had been under German occupation for 4 years were liberated in a matter of weeks. By early September, Allied forces had reached Belgium. The port of Antwerp fell on September 4th, though German forces still controlled the approaches, and the port could not yet be used. American forces crossed into Germany itself, becoming the first Allied troops to set foot on German soil. The mood among Allied commanders and soldiers alike was one of growing confidence. Germany appeared to be on the verge of collapse, but this rapid advance came with a price. Supply lines stretched back hundreds of miles to the Normandy beaches, the only major ports available to the Allies. Trucks consumed precious fuel driving supplies forward. Units that had been in constant combat since June were exhausted. Equipment needed maintenance. Replacement troops needed training and integration into their units. By September, the Allied advance began to slow, not because of German resistance, but because of logistics. General Eisenhower faced difficult decisions. He could not sustain offensives along the entire front. Limited supplies meant choosing where to concentrate effort. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding the 21st Army Group in the north, argued for a concentrated thrust toward the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland. General Omar Bradley and General Patton, commanding American forces in the center and south, advocated for continuing their advance toward the Saar and Frankfurt. Eisenhower, ever the diplomat and coalition commander, chose a broad front strategy, giving each army group objectives but ensuring that no single commander received all available resources. This decision meant that when autumn arrived, Allied forces were engaged in attritional battles along the German border. Montgomery launched Operation Market Garden in September, an ambitious attempt to seize bridges across the Rhine and open a path into northern Germany. The operation failed, with the British 1st Airborne Division suffering heavy casualties at Arnhem. American forces became embroiled in the Battle of the Ardennes Forest, a nightmarish campaign fought among the dense woods along the German border. The Ardennes Forest cost the US First Army over 33,000 casualties for minimal gains, becoming one of the costliest battles in American military history. By November, the front had largely stabilized along Germany's western border. Allied forces held positions from the Netherlands in the north to Switzerland in the south, facing the Siegfried Line, Germany's main defensive fortifications. Progress was slow, measured in yards rather than miles. The weather turned cold and wet. Morale among frontline troops began to suffer as the prospect of ending the war in 1944 faded. Replacements arrived to fill the ranks of veteran divisions that had been bled white in the summer and autumn campaigns. Meanwhile, in Germany, Adolf Hitler was planning his counterstrike. The Führer had always believed in the power of the offensive, in seizing the initiative rather than waiting passively for defeat. Throughout late summer and early autumn, as Allied forces approached Germany's borders, Hitler contemplated various options for a counteroffensive. He studied maps, consulted with his staff, and ultimately settled on a plan that was audacious to the point of recklessness. Germany's strategic situation by autumn 1944 was dire. In the east, Soviet forces had launched Operation Bagration in June, a massive offensive that destroyed German Army Group Center and drove deep into Poland. By October, Soviet troops were approaching East Prussia, the heartland of the Prussian military tradition. Romania and Bulgaria had surrendered and joined the Allies. Hungary, Germany's last remaining ally, was wavering. The Eastern Front consumed enormous resources and manpower, bleeding the Wehrmacht white in a war of attrition it could not win. In Italy, Allied forces had captured Rome in June and were slowly pushing north despite German defensive skills. In the skies over Germany, American bombers by day and British bombers by night were systematically destroying German cities and industries. Oil production, critical for mechanized warfare, had been devastated by Allied bombing. The synthetic fuel plants that Germany had relied on were rubble. Tank divisions sat immobilized for lack of fuel. The Luftwaffe, once the most formidable air force in Europe, had been bled of pilots and aircraft. Germany was being strangled. Yet Hitler refused to accept defeat. In his mind, the same audacity that had brought victory in 1940 could save Germany now. He looked at the map of the Western Front and saw an opportunity. The Ardennes sector was weakly held. American forces were stretched thin there, resting or training. If German forces could achieve surprise, they might recreate the success of 1940, when German armor had burst through the same region and routed the French army. The objective Hitler chose was Antwerp. This Belgian port had been captured by the Allies in September, but could not yet be used because German forces still controlled the approaches. If German forces could recapture Antwerp, they would cut the supply lines of the Allied armies in the north, potentially trapping British, Canadian, and American forces. Such a victory might force the Western Allies to negotiate, or at least buy time for Germany to stabilize its position and deal with the Soviet threat in the east. Hitler's senior commanders were skeptical. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall commander in the west, and Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, both believed the plan was too ambitious. They proposed more limited objectives, attacking American forces, but without trying to reach Antwerp. Hitler would hear none of it. He insisted on the full offensive, personally overseeing the planning and issuing orders that his plan was not to be altered. To make the offensive possible, Germany scraped together its last reserves. Divisions were pulled from other sectors. Equipment was hoarded. Soldiers were told they would soon launch a decisive attack that would change the course of the war. The 6th Panzer Army, under SS General Sepp Dietrich, would lead the main assault. The 5th Panzer Army, under General Hasso von Manteuffel, would attack to Dietrich's south. The 7th Army, under General Erich Brandenberger, would protect the southern flank. In total, nearly 250,000 men would participate in the initial assault. Secrecy was paramount. Hitler ordered complete radio silence to prevent Allied code breakers from detecting the buildup. Units moved at night. Vehicles were camouflaged. Soldiers were forbidden from discussing the coming operation. The deception worked better than anyone expected. Allied intelligence detected some signs of German activity, but misinterpreted them. The prevailing assessment was that Germany was preparing defensive positions, not planning an offensive. The Ardennes sector itself seemed an unlikely place for a major attack. The Americans had learned from the 1940 campaign that the terrain was difficult but passable for armor. However, in December 1944, the logic seemed different. Germany was on the defensive, conserving resources. The Ardennes, with its poor road network and difficult terrain, was not where one would expect a major offensive. General Bradley's decision to thin out the sector seemed reasonable based on the intelligence available. So the stage was set. On one side, German forces assembled in secret, their soldiers believing they were about to change the course of the war. On the other, American forces occupied the Ardennes, some resting after heavy combat, others newly arrived and inexperienced. Between them lay the forest, and the winter, and the coming storm. Operation Watch on the Rhine, Hitler's plan. The plan that Adolf Hitler conceived for what would become the Battle of the Bulge was characteristically ambitious, demanding, and risky. He gave it the code name Wacht am Rhein, or Watch on the Rhine, a deliberate deception meant to suggest a defensive operation should word leak out. The name referred to a popular German patriotic song, implying that German forces would be watching and defending the Rhine River, not launching a massive offensive westward. Hitler presented his concept to his generals on September 16, 1944, at the Wolf's Lair, his East Prussian headquarters. The assembled officers, including Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, General Alfred Jodl, and other senior commanders, listened as the Führer outlined his vision. German forces would concentrate in the Eifel region opposite the Ardennes, a buildup that would be concealed from Allied reconnaissance. Then, in a surprise attack launched during poor weather that would ground Allied aircraft, three armies would burst through the thinly held American lines. The main thrust would be delivered by the 6th Panzer Army on the northern shoulder of the attack. This army, commanded by SS Oberstgruppenführer Josef Sepp Dietrich, comprised some of the best equipped and most fanatical units remaining in the German military. Dietrich was a personal friend of Hitler, a Nazi Party loyalist who had served as Hitler's bodyguard in the 1920s. He had risen from enlisted sergeant in World War I to army commander through political connections rather than military brilliance. But he commanded the troops' respect and led units that would fight with determination. The 6th Panzer Army included several elite SS divisions. The 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, and the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Jugend. These divisions had seen extensive combat on both the eastern and western fronts. They were equipped with Germany's newest and most powerful tanks, including Tiger II, heavy tanks armed with 80cm guns that could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 1,500 yards. Their mission was to cross the Meuse River between Liège and Huy, then drive northwest to Antwerp. South of the 6th Panzer Army, the 5th Panzer Army under General Hasso von Manteuffel would attack with 3 Panzer Corps. Manteuffel was a skilled and experienced commander, perhaps the most capable of the 3 army commanders. His forces included the 2nd Panzer Division, the Panzer Lehr Division, and other mechanized units. The 5th Panzer Army's route of advance passed through terrain that, while still difficult, offered somewhat better roads than the sector assigned to Dietrich. Manteuffel's objective was also to cross the Meuse, in the area of Namur, and then wheel northwest toward Antwerp. The 7th Army, commanded by General Erich Brandenberger, had the crucial but unglamorous task of protecting the southern flank of the offensive. This army consisted primarily of infantry divisions with little armor support. Brandenberger's mission was to advance westward and establish a defensive line along the Meuse, blocking any Allied counterattacks from the south. Hitler and his staff expected that General George Patton's 3rd Army, positioned south of the Ardennes, would react quickly to the German offensive and attempt to strike the southern flank. The 7th Army's job was to prevent that. The plan called for the initial breakthrough to occur within the first day. German armor would race westward, seizing key road junctions and river crossings before American forces could react. Within 48 hours, lead elements of the Panzer armies should reach the Meuse River. Within a week, Antwerp should be in German hands. Allied forces north of the German penetration, including the British 21st Army Group and the US 1st and 9th Armies, would be cut off from their supply bases and forced to surrender or evacuate. Hitler believed this plan could work for several reasons. First, the Ardennes sector was weakly defended. Allied commanders had concentrated their forces for offensives in other sectors, leaving only 6 divisions to hold an 80-mile front in the Ardennes. These divisions were either inexperienced or exhausted from earlier fighting. Second, the weather forecast predicted several days of overcast skies, fog, and possible snow. This would ground Allied air forces, negating one of the Allies' greatest advantages. Third, Hitler believed that a major German victory would cause a split between the Americans and British, who he thought were already quarreling over strategy. But Hitler's generals had serious doubts. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, the nominal commander of all German forces in the West, thought the plan impossibly ambitious. Germany simply lacked the resources, particularly fuel, to sustain such a deep penetration. Von Rundstedt proposed a more modest operation, codenamed Small Solution, that would encircle and destroy American forces in the Ardennes without attempting to reach Antwerp. This more limited objective might actually be achievable with available resources. Field Marshal Model, commanding Army Group B, which would execute the offensive, shared von Rundstedt's concerns. Model was a capable defensive commander, nicknamed Hitler's Fireman for his ability to stabilize crumbling fronts. But even he doubted that German forces could reach Antwerp. The offensive would require perfect coordination, surprise, good luck, and an enormous amount of fuel. German armor divisions had enough fuel for about 90 miles of travel. The distance from the start line to Antwerp was over 100 miles, and that assumed a direct route with no detours or delays. The plan relied on capturing American fuel dumps, intact to sustain the advance. Model proposed his own variant, Operation Autumn Mist, which, like von Rundstedt's plan, aimed for more limited objectives. Model's plan would trap and destroy several American divisions, but would not attempt the race to Antwerp. Hitler rejected both alternatives. He wanted the bold stroke, the dramatic victory that would reshape the strategic situation. He personally supervised the detailed planning, dictating deployment schedules, routes of advance, and objectives. He attached a note to the final plan stating, "Not to be altered," making clear that his generals were to execute his vision, not modify it. Preparations began in October. Divisions were secretly moved to assembly areas in the Eifel region. The SS Panzer divisions, which had been refitting after heavy losses in Normandy, received priority for new equipment and replacements. Each tank was allocated enough fuel for approximately 90 miles. Artillery batteries were positioned, with ammunition stockpiled for the opening barrage. Everything had to be done in secrecy. The Germans imposed strict security measures. All radio communications were prohibited. Messages traveled by courier or landline telephone. Units moved at night and camouflaged their positions during the day. Soldiers were told they were preparing defensive positions, not an offensive. Only senior officers knew the true purpose of the build-up. Straw was spread on roads to muffle the sound of tanks and trucks. Air defenses were strengthened to shoot down Allied reconnaissance aircraft. To add to the deception, Hitler authorized special operations. The most famous was Operation Grief, led by SS Commando Otto Skorzeny. Skorzeny had gained fame in 1943 by rescuing Italian dictator Benito Mussolini from captivity. For the Ardennes offensive, Skorzeny assembled English-speaking German soldiers who would wear American uniforms, drive captured American vehicles, and spread confusion behind Allied lines. They were to seize bridges, change road signs, and create chaos. Although Operation Grief would achieve limited tactical success, the psychological impact would be significant, with rumors of German infiltrators causing American forces to question everyone they encountered. Another deception operation involved German paratroopers. A battalion of the 3rd Parachute Division, about 1,200 men, would drop behind American lines on the first night to seize key crossroads and disrupt communications. The paratroop drop, plagued by bad weather and poor navigation, would be largely unsuccessful, with most paratroopers scattered over a wide area. But like Operation Grief, the mere presence of German paratroopers behind American lines would add to the confusion. Hitler set the date for December 16, 1944. This timing was significant. The weather forecast predicted overcast conditions. The phase of the moon would provide some illumination for night movements, but not enough for effective Allied air reconnaissance. American forces in the Ardennes would be at their most vulnerable, with some units newly arrived and others exhausted from previous battles. As the attack date approached, German commanders received their final briefings. On December 11th and 12th, senior officers were summoned to Hitler's headquarters, now relocated to the Adlerhorst complex near Bad Nauheim. There, in a bunker deep underground, Hitler addressed them. He spoke for hours, his voice rising with passion as he described the coming operation. Germany stood at a crossroads, he declared. This offensive would decide whether the Reich survived or perished. Every soldier must fight with utmost determination. No retreat would be tolerated. Officers who failed to show sufficient fighting spirit would be removed from command. The commanders who heard Hitler's speech had mixed reactions. Some, particularly the SS officers who were true believers in National Socialism, felt inspired and determined to succeed. Others, the professional soldiers who had served in the army before the Nazis came to power, felt deep misgivings. They understood that Germany was gambling its last reserves on a plan that even in the best circumstances had only a slim chance of success. But orders were orders. In a military dictatorship, dissent meant disgrace or death. So the commanders returned to their units, briefed their subordinates, and prepared for the attack. By the night of December 15th, more than 200,000 German soldiers crouched in their assembly areas, waiting for dawn. Tank crews made final checks of their vehicles. Artillery crews positioned their guns and stacked ammunition. Infantry soldiers cleaned their weapons and tried to rest. Above them, the sky was overcast, just as the weather forecast had predicted. In a few hours, they would advance, and the course of the war would be tested once more. The first hours, December 16th, 1944. At precisely 5:30 in the morning on December 16th, 1944, the Ardennes Forest erupted. Along an 80-mile front from Monschau in the north to Echternach in the south, 1,600 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously. The barrage was massive, coordinated, devastating. For soldiers who survived it, the sound was something they would never forget. Not individual explosions, but a continuous roar, like the earth itself was screaming. High explosive shells screamed through the darkness, their paths marked by red tracers cutting through the snow-filled air. They exploded among the trees, in the villages, along the roads where American units had bedded down for the night. In foxholes and bunkers, American soldiers pressed themselves against frozen ground as the world came apart around them. Trees splintered and fell, their trunks shattered by direct hits. Buildings collapsed, walls blown apart by artillery designed to destroy fortifications. Command posts went dark as power lines were severed. Radio antennas toppled, cutting communications at the moment they were needed most. For the American soldiers on the receiving end, the experience was beyond terrifying. Many, particularly those in the newly arrived 106th Infantry Division, had never been under such intense artillery fire. Private First Class Richard McKee would later describe it. At first we thought it was our own artillery, maybe firing on some German position. But it kept going, shell after shell after shell, and we realized they were hitting all around us. The noise was incredible. You couldn't hear yourself think. You couldn't hear the man next to you screaming. All you could do was press yourself into the bottom of your foxhole and pray that none of the shells had your name on it. The barrage lasted 90 minutes. During that time, American positions along the entire front were systematically pounded. Forward observation posts were obliterated, communications centers were hit, supply dumps were targeted. The Germans had excellent intelligence on American positions gathered over weeks of careful observation. They knew where the command posts were located, where ammunition was stored, where the forward defenses were strongest, and they hit every one of those targets with precision. When the barrage finally lifted at 7 o'clock a.m., an eerie quiet fell over the forest. For a moment, the only sounds were the ringing in soldiers' ears and the crackling of fires burning in destroyed positions. Then, out of the mist and the snow, the German infantry appeared. They came out of the mist and the snow, moving in small groups, using cover, advancing with practiced skill. These were not the demoralized troops that had been retreating across France. These were soldiers who had trained for this operation, who believed they were striking a blow that would change the war. They advanced with determination, suppressing American positions with machine gun fire, working around strong points, pushing forward. Behind the infantry came the armor. German tanks rolled out of their concealed positions and moved toward the American lines. The sound of their engines echoed through the forest. Tank commanders stood in their turrets, scanning for targets, directing their drivers around obstacles. The plan called for rapid exploitation once a breakthrough was achieved. The panzer divisions were to push through the initial American defenses and race west, not stopping to reduce every pocket of resistance, leaving that task to the infantry following behind. The American response varied depending on where along the front the attack fell and which units were defending. In the northern sector, the veteran 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions faced the main assault by the 6th Panzer Army. These units, despite being surprised and heavily outnumbered, fought back with determination. They had good defensive positions on the Elsenborn Ridge, high ground that dominated the approaches. As German forces tried to advance, they ran into withering fire from entrenched American positions. The fighting around Elsenborn Ridge would prove crucial to the entire battle. The 99th Infantry Division, though relatively inexperienced, held firm against repeated German attacks. Small unit leadership made the difference. Sergeants and junior officers kept their men fighting even as casualties mounted. Artillery forward observers called in fire on German formations, breaking up attacks before they could gain momentum. The American artillery, particularly the 105mm howitzers that provided direct support to the infantry divisions, proved its worth repeatedly during the opening hours. One small unit action exemplified the resistance. An 18-man intelligence and reconnaissance platoon from the 99th Division, led by First Lieutenant Lyle Book, occupied positions near the village of Lanzerath. As German forces approached, Book's men opened fire. For hours, this tiny unit held up an entire German parachute battalion. They inflicted heavy casualties and caused significant delays. When they finally ran out of ammunition late in the afternoon and were forced to surrender, they had held their position for more than 12 hours, buying time for other American units to prepare defenses. In the center of the German assault, the inexperienced 106th Infantry Division bore the brunt of the 5th Panzer Army's attack. The 106th had arrived in the Ardennes just 5 days earlier, fresh from training in England. Most of its soldiers had never been in combat. Their positions were spread across a wide front, with limited reserves. When the German attack hit, 2 regiments of the 106th, the 422nd and 423rd, found themselves rapidly surrounded. Cut off from supply and reinforcement, unable to communicate effectively with higher headquarters, these regiments fought for several days before being forced to surrender. The loss of these 2 regiments, approximately 8,000 men, was one of the largest mass surrenders of American forces in World War II. Further south, the 28th Infantry Division defended a sector that included the critical road junction at Bastogne. The 28th was a veteran division, but had been badly mauled in the Ardennes Forest. It was in the Ardennes to rest and absorb replacements. When the German attack came, elements of the division fought delaying actions, trading space for time, falling back slowly while inflicting casualties on the advancing Germans. Their resistance would prove important, as it slowed the German advance and gave Allied commanders time to react. The German 7th Army's attack in the south achieved initial success. Infantry divisions pushed westward against the thinly held American positions. But the 7th Army lacked armor and moved more slowly than the Panzer armies to its north. Its mission was defensive, to protect the southern flank, and in this it would largely succeed, at least initially. As reports of the attack reached higher headquarters, Allied commanders struggled to understand what was happening. The fog of war was thick that morning. Communications were disrupted. Units reported they were under attack, but the scale and scope were unclear. Was this a local counterattack? A spoiling attack to disrupt planned Allied operations, or something larger? At General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group headquarters in Luxembourg City, staff officers plotted reported German positions on maps. The pattern that emerged was concerning. Attacks were occurring all along the Ardennes front. This was not a local action. This was a major offensive. Bradley, conferring with his intelligence chief, Brigadier General Edwin Sibert, tried to estimate German intentions. If the Germans were attacking in the Ardennes, what did that mean for other sectors? Should Bradley shift forces from his planned offensives to reinforce the threatened sector? General Courtney Hodges, commanding the U.S. First Army, which was responsible for the Ardennes sector, was initially skeptical that the attack represented a major threat. His headquarters staff debated whether this might be a German attempt to disrupt the upcoming Allied offensive scheduled for December. Perhaps the Germans had detected preparations and were trying to preempt the attack. Only as more reports came in, as the scale of German forces became clearer, did Hodges and his staff realize they faced a crisis. General Eisenhower, at his headquarters in Versailles, received word of the attack later in the morning. His initial reaction was to send reinforcements. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, resting near Reims after the failed Market Garden operation, were immediately alerted. These 2 divisions, elite units trained for rapid deployment, would be rushed to the Ardennes within 24 hours. Eisenhower also directed that the 7th Armored Division be sent to help defend Saint-Vith, a critical road junction in the center of the German attack. But these reinforcements would take time to arrive. On December 16th, the battle was being fought by the units already in place, units that were surprised, outnumbered, and in some cases, surrounded. The first day of the Battle of the Bulge belonged to the Germans. They achieved surprise, they gained ground, they inflicted casualties and captured prisoners. But they also encountered resistance that, while it bent, did not break. American soldiers, fighting alone in the snow and the forest, held key positions. Artillery crews stayed at their guns, firing until German tanks were practically on top of them. Combat engineers blew bridges to delay the German advance. As darkness fell on December 16th, the situation was chaotic and confused. German forces had penetrated the American lines in multiple places. Some American units were surrounded, others were retreating in disorder. Communications were still disrupted, but the Germans had not achieved the rapid breakthrough they needed. At Elsenborn Ridge, American defenses held. Critical road junctions were still in American hands. The timetable for the offensive was already slipping. In German headquarters, commanders assessed the day's results with mixed feelings. Progress had been made, ground had been gained, but the advance was behind schedule. The 6th Panzer Army, which was supposed to make the deepest penetration, had been held up by American resistance. Kampfgruppe Piper, the armored spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division, had not even begun its advance until afternoon because of traffic jams and delays. The 5th Panzer Army in the center had made better progress, but even there, American units were fighting hard. The weather, which was supposed to favor the Germans, proved a mixed blessing. The overcast skies did ground Allied aircraft, but they also made movement difficult. Snow began falling heavily in some sectors, reducing visibility and making roads slippery. The poor road network in the Ardennes, which planners had recognized as a problem, was already causing traffic jams. Tanks and trucks bunched up on narrow roads, unable to bypass slower vehicles. Fuel consumption increased as vehicles idled in traffic. As night fell, soldiers on both sides tried to rest, to warm themselves, to prepare for the next day. The Americans had survived the first assault, but barely. The Germans had gained ground, but not as much as planned. Both sides knew that the next few days would be critical. The battle, this gigantic collision of armies in the frozen Ardennes, was just beginning. The northern shoulder, Elsenborn Ridge and Kampfgruppe Piper. The northern shoulder of the German offensive, where the 6th Panzer Army attacked, became the scene of some of the most intense and consequential fighting of the entire battle. The fate of Hitler's plan hinged on this sector. If the 6th Panzer Army could break through and race westward, German armor could reach the Meuse River within days. If it was held up, the entire offensive would lose momentum. The key terrain feature in this sector was Elsenborn Ridge, a series of high hills east of the Belgian town of Elsenborn. From these hills, observers could see for miles in every direction. Artillery positioned on the ridge could bring fire down on any German forces trying to advance westward. For the Germans to succeed, they needed to capture this ridge. For the Americans, holding it was essential. The 99th Infantry Division occupied positions on and around Elsenborn Ridge. This division, nicknamed the Checkerboard Division for its distinctive insignia, had arrived in Europe in November and had been in combat for only about a month. Many of its soldiers were still learning the hard lessons of warfare, but they were well-trained, well-led, and determined. When the German attack hit on the morning of December 16th, the 99th Division held its ground. The German assault in this sector was led by the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend and elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division. These were among the elite units of the Waffen-SS, buzzed with fanatical young soldiers who had been indoctrinated with Nazi ideology. They attacked with determination, but they encountered fierce resistance. American artillery fire broke up German formations. Machine gun positions cut down advancing infantry. Minefields channeled German tanks into kill zones where they could be engaged by American tank destroyers. For 2 days, December 16th and 17th, the battle raged around Elsenborn Ridge. The twin villages of Rocherath and Krinkelt, just west of the ridge, became the focus of intense fighting. German tanks pushed into the villages, only to be met by American armor and anti-tank weapons at close range. Buildings changed hands multiple times. The fighting was brutal, sometimes hand-to-hand. Both sides suffered heavy casualties. By December 18th, it became clear that the Germans could not break through at Elsenborn Ridge. The American defense had held. The 99th Division, reinforced by elements of the 2nd Infantry Division, another veteran unit, maintained its positions. General Walter Robertson, commanding Vierkorps, which included these divisions, ordered his units to form a continuous defensive line anchored on Elsenborn Ridge. This line would hold for the duration of the battle, becoming the northern shoulder of the Bulge, the point beyond which German forces could not advance. The failure to take Elsenborn Ridge had profound consequences for the German offensive. The roads that ran through this sector were the best in the region, capable of handling heavy traffic. The plan had called for the 6th Panzer Army to use these roads to race to the Meuse. With those roads blocked, German forces had to find alternate routes through terrain that was even more difficult. This is where Kampfgruppe Peiper enters the story. Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper commanded a battle group from the 1st SS Panzer Division. Peiper was 29 years old, highly decorated, and known for his aggressive tactics and ruthless determination. His Kampfgruppe consisted of approximately 5,000 men according to military records, including mechanized infantry, engineers, and artillery, built around a core of tank formations that included King Tiger tanks, the most powerful tanks in the German arsenal, along with Panthers and Mark IVs. Peiper's mission was to serve as the spearhead of the 6th Panzer Army. Once the infantry had created a gap in American lines, Peiper was to race through, seizing bridges over the Meuse River and establishing bridgeheads for the follow-on forces. Speed was essential. Peiper was ordered to move rapidly, bypassing American strongpoints, leaving mopping-up operations to the units following behind. His instructions were clear: drive west, don't stop, reach the Meuse. But Peiper's advance got off to a bad start. Traffic jams delayed his initial move forward. When his column finally began moving on the afternoon of December 16th, more than 12 hours behind schedule, it immediately encountered problems. The roads were narrow and clogged with other German units. Peiper's frustration grew. He bypassed slower units when possible, but the terrain limited his options. On December 17th, Kampfgruppe Peiper broke through American lines and began its race westward. Peiper's route took him through a series of small Belgian villages: Honsfeld, Bullingen, Ligneville, Stavelot. At each location, his forces encountered American units and civilians. What happened in these villages would haunt the campaign and lead to one of the most notorious war crimes of the Western Front. At Honsfeld, Peiper's men captured American soldiers and supplies, including desperately needed fuel. At Bullingen, they seized another fuel dump. But at the Baugner crossroads near Malmedy, something happened that would transform the entire character of the battle. On December 17th, at approximately 1:00 p.m., elements of Kampfgruppe Peiper encountered an American convoy from the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. The Americans, lightly armed observation troops with no heavy weapons, were quickly overrun. What happened next remains disputed in its precise details, but the outcome is grimly clear. Approximately 120 American soldiers were taken prisoner and herded into a snow-covered field at the crossroads. Then, witnesses would later testify, the German guards opened fire with machine guns. The exact circumstances, whether this was a premeditated order, a spontaneous decision, or a situation that escalated beyond control, would be debated in war crimes trials after the war. But the facts are undeniable. 84 American soldiers were killed. Evidence recovered from the frozen bodies showed that some had been shot while standing with their hands raised in surrender. Others were shot while trying to flee into the nearby woods. German soldiers walked among the bodies, shooting anyone who showed signs of life. Approximately 43 Americans survived by playing dead or escaping into the forest, and their testimony would later reveal the horror of what had occurred. What triggered the massacre remains unclear. The question of who gave the order, whether Piper himself or his battalion commander Werner Poetschke or a lower-ranking officer acting on his own initiative, was never definitively resolved, though Poetschke was identified by multiple witnesses as being directly responsible. What we do know is that Piper's unit had a reputation for ruthlessness earned on the Eastern Front, and that the culture within the Kampfgruppe suggested that caring for prisoners was viewed as a burden to be avoided. News of the massacre spread quickly through American units. Soldiers who heard about it felt a combination of rage and determination. The rules had changed. The Germans had shown they would murder prisoners. American soldiers vowed to take revenge, and they did. For the rest of the battle, German soldiers trying to surrender sometimes found themselves shot by Americans who remembered Malmedy. The massacre had accomplished the opposite of what the SS leadership may have intended. Rather than terrorizing American forces into surrender, it stiffened their resolve. Men who might have considered capitulation when surrounded now fought to the death. The intensity of combat increased dramatically. At Chenogne, Belgium, on January 1, 1945, American soldiers from the 11th Armored Division murdered approximately 60 German POWs in retaliation. The Battle of the Bulge, which had begun as a conventional military operation, had descended into something darker, more personal, more vicious. And Piper's Kampfgruppe, the spearhead of Hitler's entire offensive, was about to learn that murder has consequences. Piper's Kampfgruppe continued its advance. On December 18th, they reached the town of Stavelot on the Amblève River. The bridge across the river was crucial. If Piper could cross, he would have a clear route westward. American engineers had prepared the bridge for demolition, but hesitated, hoping that American units on the far side might still retreat across it. Piper's advanced guard seized the bridge intact in the early hours of December 18th. But then the advance stalled. American forces, now alerted to Piper's presence, began to react. The 30th Infantry Division, a veteran unit, moved into blocking positions. Combat engineers blew bridges behind Piper, cutting his supply line. American artillery began to hammer German positions. Piper's fuel situation became critical. His tanks consumed gasoline at a prodigious rate, and resupply was impossible with the bridges behind him destroyed. By December 19th, Kampfgruppe Piper was isolated in the village of La Glaise. American forces surrounded the German position. Piper's tanks, out of fuel, were abandoned. His wounded could not be evacuated. Food and ammunition were running low. Piper radioed for instructions and was told to break out and make his way back to German lines on foot. On the night of December 23rd, Piper and his surviving men abandoned their vehicles and equipment and slipped through American lines. They left behind all of their tanks, their artillery, their wounded. Of the 5,000 men who had set out with Kampfgruppe Piper, fewer than 800 made it back. The spearhead of the 6th Panzer Army had been destroyed without reaching the Meuse. The failure of the 6th Panzer Army and Kampfgruppe Piper had decisive consequences. The best German units, attacking in the sector with the best roads, had been stopped. The northern shoulder of the Bulge was firmly established. German forces would make deeper penetrations in other sectors, but they would never achieve the rapid breakthrough that might have led to Antwerp. The American defense on the northern shoulder, costly as it was, had blunted Hitler's main effort. The center, St. Vith, and the fighting withdrawal, while the battle raged on the northern shoulder around Elsenborn Ridge, Equally important fighting took place in the center of the German offensive. The key location here was Saint-Vith, a small Belgian town that sat at a critical road junction. 7 roads converged at Saint-Vith, making it a transportation hub. For the Germans to sustain their advance, they needed these roads. For the Americans, holding Saint-Vith meant denying those roads to the enemy and buying time for reinforcements to arrive. The 106th Infantry Division held this sector when the German attack began. As we have seen, 2 of the division's regiments, the 422nd and 423rd, were quickly surrounded and would eventually surrender. But the division's 3rd regiment, the 424th, along with division headquarters and supporting units, managed to fall back to Saint-Vith. There they were joined by elements of the 7th Armored Division, which had been rushed south on Eisenhower's orders. The 7th Armored Division was a veteran unit that had fought across France. It included both tanks and mechanized infantry, making it well suited for the mobile defense that the situation required. But the division's march to Saint-Vith was hampered by traffic jams, poor weather, and conflicting orders. Units arrived piecemeal, often going straight into action without time to rest or reconnoiter. Brigadier General Robert Hasbrouck commanded the 7th Armored Division. When he arrived at Saint-Vith on December 17th, he found a confusing situation. Remnants of the 106th Division, scattered units from other formations, and civilian refugees all crowded the town. Communications were poor. Information about German positions was sketchy. Hasbrouck worked to establish a coherent defense, positioning his armored units to block the main roads leading into Saint-Vith. The German forces attacking in this sector belonged to the 5th Panzer Army under General von Manteuffel. Manteuffel was perhaps the most competent of the German army commanders involved in the offensive. He had modified Hitler's plans, attacking before dawn without an artillery preparation, relying on surprise and infiltration tactics. His approach worked. The 5th Panzer Army made better progress on December 16th than the 6th Panzer Army to the north, but Saint-Vith became an obstacle. Manteuffel needed those roads. He ordered the 18th Volksgrenadier Division and elements of the 62nd Volksgrenadier Division to take the town. These were infantry divisions, supported by assault guns, and they attacked Saint-Vith from multiple directions. The fighting for the town lasted from December 17th to December 23rd. The American defense of Saint-Vith has been compared to the famous defense of Bastogne, though it receives less attention. The defenders held off repeated German attacks, inflicting heavy casualties and buying time. American tank crews learned to use the terrain to their advantage, positioning their Shermans hull down behind embankments where they could engage advancing German armor. Infantry held buildings and roadblocks, making the Germans pay for every advance. Colonel Dwight Rosebaum's combat, Command B of the 9th Armored Division, played a key role. His tanks and infantry held a position at the town of Saint-Vith's eastern approaches, absorbing repeated German attacks. When his units finally pulled back, they had destroyed numerous German vehicles and killed hundreds of enemy soldiers. But the situation around Saint-Vith gradually worsened. German forces worked around the American positions, threatening to encircle the defenders. By December 21st, it was clear that Saint-Vith could not be held. General Bruce Clark, commanding Combat Command B of the 7th Armored Division, and General Hasbrouck agreed that withdrawal was necessary to avoid being surrounded. The withdrawal from Saint-Vith on the night of December the 21st to 22 was a difficult operation. Units had to disengage from contact with the enemy, pull back along roads that were often under fire, and avoid being cut off by German forces maneuvering around the flanks. The 7th Armored Division's combat commands provided covering forces, with tanks and infantry holding blocking positions while other units passed through. The retreat was conducted in freezing temperatures and falling snow. Vehicles slipped on icy roads. Some units, unable to evacuate their wounded, had to leave them behind with medical personnel who stayed to care for them. Equipment that could not be moved was destroyed to prevent its capture. The men, exhausted from days of continuous combat, drove themselves forward through sheer willpower. By December 23rd, the survivors of the St. Vith defense had pulled back to new positions west of the town. They had lost St. Vith, but they had delayed the German advance by nearly a week. That week proved crucial. It gave Allied commanders time to bring up reinforcements. It allowed the defense at Bastogne to be established. It disrupted the German timetable irreparably. The cost had been high. The 7th Armored Division suffered heavy casualties. The 106th Infantry Division, which had lost 2 regiments in the first days of the battle, was effectively destroyed as a fighting force. Small units and individual soldiers displayed extraordinary courage. Tank crews fought until their vehicles were destroyed. Infantry squads held positions against overwhelming odds. Medics treated the wounded under fire. All of this occurred in some of the worst weather conditions imaginable. The soldiers who fought at St. Vith received less recognition than those at Bastogne, but their contribution was equally important. They held a critical point against repeated attacks. They disrupted German plans. They proved that even when surprised and outnumbered, American forces could fight effectively. The defense of St. Vith was a soldier's battle, decided by the determination and skill of small units and junior leaders. It showed that the American army, though caught off guard at the start of the offensive, was resilient and capable of adapting to crisis. Bastogne, the siege that defined the battle of all the places where the Battle of the Bulge was fought. None is more famous than Bastogne. This small Belgian town, population about 4,000 in 1944, sat at a critical crossroads. 7 roads converged there, roads that the Germans desperately needed to sustain their advance. The defense of Bastogne became the symbol of American determination, courage, and ultimately victory in the battle. The story of Bastogne began on December 17th, when General Eisenhower, recognizing the threat to this key location, ordered the 101st Airborne Division to move there immediately. The 101st, the famous Screaming Eagles, was resting at Camp Mourmelon near Reims after the failed Operation Market Garden. When the alert came, the division packed quickly. Most soldiers didn't even have winter clothing or adequate ammunition, but there was no time to draw proper supplies. They loaded onto trucks and headed for Bastogne. The 101st Airborne was an elite formation, trained for rapid deployment and hard fighting. It had distinguished itself in Normandy on D-Day and in Holland during Market Garden. Now it would face its greatest test. Leading the division was Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the division artillery commander who was serving as acting commander because Major General Maxwell Taylor was attending a conference in Washington. McAuliffe was 46 years old, a career artillery officer who had served in the Army since graduating from West Point in 1918. He was known for his competence, his calm demeanor under pressure, and his direct manner of speaking. He would need all these qualities in the days ahead. The 101st Airborne arrived at Bastogne on the night of December 18th and 19th, beating the advancing Germans by just hours. They immediately began preparing defenses. The situation was confused. German forces were approaching from multiple directions. American units that had been defending east of Bastogne were streaming back through town, some in good order, others in disorder. McAuliffe worked to establish a perimeter defense, positioning his 4 regiments around the town in a rough circle. The 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment defended the northeast. The 506th held the east. The 502nd covered the north and northwest. The 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, along with supporting units, covered the south. In the center, near Bastogne itself, McAuliffe positioned his artillery. The 101st had excellent artillery support. including several battalions of field artillery that could bring concentrated fire on any German attack. Also at Bastogne were elements of the 10th Armored Division, which had been fighting delaying actions east of the town, and various other units that had fallen back to Bastogne. The total American force in and around the town numbered approximately 18,000 men. Against them, the Germans would eventually commit parts of 7 divisions, totaling more than 45,000 men, along with significant armor support. The siege of Bastogne began on December 21st, when German forces completed their encirclement of the town. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division attacked from the northeast. The Panzer-Lehr Division, an elite armored formation, attacked from the west. Other units closed in from other directions. The Germans probed the American defenses, looking for weak points, launching attacks where they thought they could break through. But the American perimeter held. The terrain around Bastogne favored the defenders. The town sat on slightly higher ground than the surrounding area, giving defenders good observation. Woods provided cover for defensive positions. The roads which the Germans needed to capture could be covered by artillery fire, and the men of the 101st Airborne fought with skill and determination. Each attack followed a similar pattern. German infantry, supported by tanks, would advance toward the American lines. American forward observers would call in artillery fire, breaking up the formations. As Germans got closer, machine guns and rifles would open fire. If German tanks broke through, they would be engaged by American tank destroyers, or bazookas. The fighting was intense but relatively brief. The Germans would withdraw, regroup, and try again. The weather played a significant role. Heavy snow fell repeatedly, reducing visibility and making movement difficult. Temperatures dropped well below freezing. The wounded suffered terribly from the cold. Medical supplies ran low. The defenders lacked proper winter clothing. Frostbite and trench foot became serious problems, reducing the effective strength of American units. Food was also in short supply. The 101st had departed for Bastogne so hastily that it lacked adequate supplies. Soldiers subsisted on K-rations and whatever could be scrounged locally. Ammunition was carefully rationed. Artillery observers were told to call for fire only on high-priority targets. The troops dug into frozen ground, trying to create positions that would protect them from both enemy fire and the weather. On December 22nd, the Germans made a formal attempt to get the Americans to surrender. At about 11:30 am, 4 German soldiers approached American lines under a white flag. They carried a written ultimatum from the commander of the German forces surrounding Bastogne. The message, formal and threatening in tone, stated that the Americans were completely surrounded by superior forces, that their situation was hopeless, and that if they did not surrender within 2 hours, German artillery would annihilate every American soldier and civilian in the town. The German emissaries were blindfolded and taken to a command post of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment. From there, the message was relayed to McAuliffe at division headquarters. McAuliffe was catching a brief rest in his sleeping quarters when his Chief of Staff, Lieutenant Colonel Ned Moore, woke him. Moore read the surrender demand aloud. McAuliffe listened, then offered his immediate, unrehearsed reaction, "Oh, nuts." Then he went back to sleep. His staff officers, however, realized they needed an official reply. They stood around trying to draft something suitably defiant yet professional. Various lengthy, formal responses were suggested and rejected. Then Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, the division operations officer, spoke up. "That first crack of yours was hard to beat, General." McAuliffe, now awake again, looked confused. "What do you mean?" "You said nuts, General." The room went silent for a moment. Then the other officers began to nod. Someone laughed. Yes, that was perfect. That one word captured exactly what they all felt. They weren't intimidated, they weren't surrendering. The German ultimatum was, quite simply, nuts. So McAuliffe sat down with a pencil and paper and wrote his official reply. It read in its entirety: "To the German commander, nuts, the American commander. Colonel Joseph Harper, commanding the 327th Glider Infantry, volunteered to deliver the message personally. He seemed to relish the opportunity. When he found the German emissaries waiting blindfolded in the woods, he handed them the paper with evident satisfaction. The German officers looked at the message, then at Harper, clearly puzzled. One of them asked in English, 'What does this mean?' Harper's reply has become legend. 'In plain English, it's the same as go to hell. And I'll tell you something else. If you continue to attack, we will kill every goddamn German that tries to break into this city.' The Germans saluted stiffly, turned, and departed. When they reported back to their commander and explained the meaning of the American response, the reaction was reportedly one of stunned disbelief. The Americans, surrounded and outnumbered more than 2-1, low on supplies and ammunition, had not only refused to surrender, they had insulted the German commander in the process. Within hours, soldiers throughout the American army heard about McAuliffe's reply. It became a rallying cry. Radio operators signed off their transmissions with "nuts." Soldiers shouted it as a greeting. Artillery crews chalked it on their shells before firing them at German positions. That single word came to symbolize American defiance, not just at Bastogne, but in the entire Battle of the Bulge. It suggested that Americans, even when facing overwhelming odds, maintained not just their courage, but their sense of humor. The psychological impact was profound. For the American soldiers at Bastogne, McAuliffe's response reinforced their determination to hold. For American forces elsewhere in the Ardennes, it became proof that the surrounded garrison hadn't given up, that relief was still worth fighting for. For the Germans, it must have been deeply unsettling. They had expected demoralization, perhaps surrender. Instead, they received mockery. The promised German artillery barrage materialized later that day, but it was not the devastating attack that had been threatened. The German artillery was conserving ammunition, and American positions were well protected. The shelling caused casualties, but did not break the defense. The Luftwaffe also attacked Bastogne. German bombers struck the town at night, causing damage and casualties. But the psychological effect was limited. The soldiers of the 101st had been bombed before, in Normandy and Holland. They knew how to take cover, how to survive. What the Germans at Bastogne didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that their window of opportunity was rapidly closing. While they wasted precious time trying to convince the Americans to surrender, while they prepared for renewed attacks, while they committed more and more forces to reducing this one Belgian town, something extraordinary was happening to the south. An entire American army was pivoting 90 degrees and racing north to break the siege, and it was moving faster than anyone, including some American commanders, had thought possible. Inside the perimeter, morale remained surprisingly good. The soldiers understood their situation. They were surrounded, outnumbered, low on supplies. But they also believed they would be relieved. They had confidence in their commanders, in each other, and in the American army's ability to respond to the crisis. They knew that General Patton was coming, that his Third Army was fighting its way north to break the siege. And Patton was indeed coming. But the story of how he got there reveals something that would have shocked both German commanders and most Allied officers. The Americans had been partially prepared for this disaster. On December 19th, 3 days after the German offensive began, Eisenhower held an emergency conference at Verdun. The atmosphere was tense. German forces had achieved total surprise. American units were retreating, surrounded, or destroyed. Eisenhower opened the meeting by saying, "The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster. Some officers looked skeptical. Patton, never one to miss a dramatic moment, grinned and said, "Hell, let's have the guts to let the bastards go all the way to Paris. Then we'll really cut 'em off and chew 'em up." Eisenhower, unamused, cut to the point. "George, when can you attack?" Patton's answer stopped the room. "December 22nd, with 3 divisions." That was in 3 days. Patton's Third Army was currently fighting more than 100 miles to the southeast, engaged in the Saar offensive. To disengage from combat, pivot 90 degrees, move 3 divisions through winter weather over clogged roads, and launch a coordinated attack seemed impossible. Bradley thought Patton was being reckless. Even Eisenhower questioned whether it could be done. But here's what nobody except Patton and his staff knew. They had already planned for exactly this scenario. While Allied intelligence at the highest levels had been caught completely off guard, while generals and colonels at Schaeff had dismissed any possibility of a German offensive, one man had seen it coming. Colonel Oskar Koch, Patton's intelligence officer, had been tracking German movements for weeks. On December 9th, a full week before the attack, Koch had briefed Patton on suspicious concentrations of German forces opposite the Ardennes. His assessment was prescient. A major German offensive was not only possible, it was likely. Patton, who trusted Koch implicitly, had done something that would prove decisive. He ordered his staff to prepare contingency plans for pivoting north to meet a German breakthrough. 3 different operational orders were drafted, one for each possible direction of attack. Maps were prepared, movement schedules were calculated. Units were quietly alerted that plans might change. When Eisenhower gave the order at Verdun, Patton's staff didn't have to start from scratch. They simply activated plans that already existed. This preparation made the impossible possible. On December 22nd, exactly when Patton had promised, 3 divisions of his Third Army attacked north through blinding snow. It remains one of the most impressive command achievements of World War II, but it only worked because someone had paid attention to the warning signs everyone else ignored. On December 22nd, 3 divisions of Patton's Third Army attacked north through heavy snow and bitter cold. The 4th Armored Division, commanded by Major General Hugh Gaffey, led the advance. Behind it came the 26th and 80th Infantry Divisions. These units fought their way forward against determined German resistance. The 7th Army, defending the southern shoulder of the Bulge, tried to stop Patton's advance. But the American units pushed on, taking casualties but gaining ground. At Bastogne, the defenders heard radio reports of Patton's advance. They knew relief was coming. They just had to hold on. The fighting continued. German attacks came from different directions, testing the perimeter, looking for weaknesses. On December 23rd, the weather finally cleared. American transport aircraft flew supply missions to Bastogne, dropping ammunition, medical supplies, and food by parachute. Fighter bombers attacked German positions around the town. The psychological lift was enormous. The defenders were no longer alone. On December 26th, elements of the 4th Armored Division broke through to Bastogne. The 37th Tank Battalion, led by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, fought its way to the southern edge of the perimeter. The siege was broken. Wounded could be evacuated. Supplies could be brought in. The garrison had held for 8 days against overwhelming odds. The defense of Bastogne did not end the battle. Fighting continued in and around the town for weeks. But the successful defense had stopped the German advance. The roads through Bastogne, which the Germans needed to sustain their offensive, remained in American hands. Hitler's gamble had failed, in large part because of what happened in this small Belgian town. The soldiers who defended Bastogne became heroes. The 101st Airborne received a Presidential Unit Citation, one of the highest honors that can be bestowed on a military unit. General McAuliffe was promoted and received the Distinguished Service Cross. His nuts reply entered American popular culture, a symbol of defiance against tyranny. But the real story of Bastogne is simpler and more profound. It is the story of soldiers who were cold, hungry, outnumbered, and surrounded, but who refused to give up. It is the story of junior officers and sergeants who led their men with skill and courage. It is the story of medics who treated the wounded under fire, of engineers who repaired damaged equipment, of artillerymen who fired their guns until the barrels glowed red. It is ultimately the story of ordinary Americans who, when called upon, did extraordinary things. The Allied response: command decisions under pressure. While soldiers fought and died in the snow-covered forests and towns of the Ardennes, senior Allied commanders struggled to understand the scope of the German offensive and to formulate an effective response. The decisions made in command posts far from the front would prove crucial to the outcome of the battle. When news of the German attack first reached Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, at Versailles on the morning of December 16th, the reaction was one of concern, but not panic. General Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander, had built his career on maintaining calm under pressure. He immediately recognized that the German attack, regardless of its ultimate objective, represented a crisis that required immediate action. Eisenhower's first moves were to send reinforcements to the threatened sector and to halt planned Allied offensives in other areas. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, resting near Reims, were ordered to move to the Ardennes immediately. The 7th Armored Division was directed to defend Saint-Vith. The 10th Armored Division was sent to support forces around Bastogne. These decisions, made within hours of learning of the attack, would prove crucial. But Eisenhower faced a larger strategic problem. The German offensive had split the American forces. General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group headquarters was in Luxembourg City, south of the Bulge. The U.S. First Army, under General Courtney Hodges, was being attacked directly. Bradley's communications with Hodges and with units north of the German penetration became increasingly difficult as the Bulge widened. Coordination of the defense was becoming problematic. On December 19th, Eisenhower made one of the most controversial decisions of his command. He temporarily transferred 2 American armies, the 1st and 9th, from Bradley's 12th Army Group to Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group. This meant that Montgomery, a British officer, would command American forces during the crisis. The decision was militarily sound, as Montgomery's headquarters was better positioned to coordinate forces north of the Bulge, but it wounded American pride and infuriated some American commanders, particularly Patton. Bradley was deeply upset by this decision. He felt it implied that he had failed in his duties and that American forces needed to be rescued by British leadership. In truth, Eisenhower's decision was pragmatic. Communications between Bradley's headquarters and his northern armies were tenuous. Montgomery's headquarters could coordinate the northern sector more effectively, but the perception mattered, and the decision created tensions that would last beyond the battle itself. Montgomery arrived at Hodges' 1st Army headquarters on December 20th. His reception was cool. American officers resented his presence and his manner, which could be condescending. But Montgomery did bring organizational skill and a clear tactical vision. He ordered the establishment of a solid defensive line north of the Bulge, pulling back forces where necessary to create a continuous front. He positioned British reserves behind the American lines, ready to intervene if the Germans broke through. Montgomery also began planning for a counteroffensive, though on a longer timeline than Patton was advocating. Montgomery believed in careful preparation, in building up overwhelming force before attacking. This cautious approach frustrated American commanders who wanted to strike immediately. But it reflected Montgomery's experience and his determination not to launch attacks that might fail. The most immediate and dramatic Allied response came from General Patton and his Third Army. At the Verdun Conference on December 19th, when Eisenhower asked his commanders when they could attack north toward the Bulge, Patton replied immediately, "December 23rd?" The other commanders looked skeptical. Bradley said such a rapid movement was impossible. Even Eisenhower questioned whether Patton could meet that deadline, but Patton was confident. He had anticipated the crisis. His intelligence chief, Colonel Koch, had warned that a German offensive in the Ardennes was possible. Patton had ordered his staff to prepare contingency plans for pivoting the Third Army to meet such a threat. When the order came, Patton's staff went into action immediately. Pivoting an army is one of the most difficult maneuvers in warfare. It requires disengaging units from combat, moving them long distances, often in severe weather, and then launching them into battle in a new sector. Patton's Third Army had to move more than 100 miles in winter over roads choked with refugees and retreating units, while maintaining combat readiness. That Patton achieved this in 48 hours remains one of the remarkable command achievements of the war. 3 divisions led Patton's attack: the 4th Armored Division under Major General Hugh Gaffey, the 26th Infantry Division under Major General Willard Paul, and the 80th Infantry Division under Major General Horace McBride. These units attacked north through blinding snow on December 22nd, hitting the southern flank of the German penetration. The fighting was brutal. The Germans, anticipating an attack from the south, had positioned the 7th Army to block exactly such a move. But Patton's divisions pressed forward. American soldiers advanced through waist-deep snow, under fire, in temperatures well below freezing. Tank crews fought in conditions that froze lubricants and made equipment malfunction. But they continued to advance. Patton personally drove forward, visiting command posts, urging his subordinates to maintain pressure. He was everywhere along the front, his presence boosting morale. His famous profanity-laced speeches, while sometimes shocking, left no doubt about his determination. "Drive like hell," he told his tank commanders. Every hour counted. The garrison at Bastogne was depending on them. By December 23rd, the weather began to clear. This change proved decisive. For the first week of the battle, overcast skies and fog had grounded Allied aircraft. The Germans had planned for this, choosing the attack date based on weather forecasts that predicted poor visibility. But weather is unpredictable. On December 23rd, the skies cleared. Allied air power, which had been the dominant force in Western Europe since D-Day, returned with a vengeance. Fighter bombers struck German tanks, trucks, and troop concentrations. Heavy bombers attacked German communication centers and supply depots. Transport aircraft flew supply missions to Bastogne and other surrounded units. The psychological effect was enormous. American soldiers, who had been fighting without air support, suddenly saw friendly aircraft overhead. German soldiers, who had advanced without fear of air attack, now had to contend with bombs and rockets. The air attacks were devastating for German logistics. Fuel trucks were destroyed. Supply columns were scattered. Roads became impassable due to wrecked vehicles. The German offensive, already behind schedule and running short of fuel, lost whatever momentum it had retained. Meanwhile, in the north, Montgomery prepared his own counteroffensive. He was slow, methodical, and careful, which frustrated Eisenhower and American commanders. But by early January, Montgomery was ready. British and American forces under his command would attack southward, while Patton's forces pushed north. The two pincers would meet, trapping German forces in the Bulge. Eisenhower, throughout this period, maintained overall control while allowing his subordinate commanders freedom to execute their plans. He dealt with competing egos, conflicting national interests, and enormous pressure from political leaders in Washington and London. His ability to keep the alliance functioning, to balance American and British interests, and to maintain focus on the military objective was crucial to victory. The command structure during the Battle of the Bulge was complex and sometimes dysfunctional. Personalities clashed, national pride was wounded, Mistakes were made. But ultimately, Allied commanders adapted to the crisis, moved reinforcements to critical points, and coordinated a response that first contained and then crushed the German offensive. The command decisions made in those critical days of December determined the outcome as surely as the fighting on the front lines. The weather turns, air power, and the shifting tide. For the first week of the Battle of the Bulge, weather dominated the battlefield almost as much as the armies themselves. Heavy clouds, thick fog, and falling snow grounded Allied aircraft and gave German forces a brief window of opportunity. But when the weather changed, so did the character of the battle. Adolf Hitler had deliberately chosen the timing of the offensive to coincide with poor weather conditions. German meteorologists had predicted that overcast skies and low clouds would persist through late December. This forecast proved accurate for the first several days of the battle. On December the 16th, when the offensive began, visibility was so poor that pilots described the region as socked in. Allied reconnaissance aircraft could not fly. Fighter bombers sat on their airfields, unable to provide support to ground forces. This absence of Allied air power gave German forces a significant advantage. Since the Normandy invasion, German troops had learned to fear the Allied aircraft that seemed to control the skies. Fighter bombers could destroy tanks, strafe columns, and make daylight movement suicidal. But in the opening days of the Ardennes offensive, German forces could move freely. Tanks advanced without fear of air attack. Supply columns traveled on roads in daylight. The temporary absence of Allied air power was, from the German perspective, one of the few things that went according to plan. American soldiers on the ground felt the absence of air support acutely. They had grown accustomed to calling in airstrikes when faced with strong German positions. Tank crews knew that if German armor appeared, they could request fighter-bomber support. Artillery observers could direct aircraft onto targets. But in the Ardennes, in December 1944, when American soldiers looked to the sky, they saw only clouds and falling snow. The weather also affected ground operations in numerous ways. Heavy snow made movement difficult. Vehicles slipped on icy roads. Soldiers wading through knee-deep snow tired quickly. Visibility was often measured in yards rather than miles. Commanders could not see the battlefield, could not coordinate movements effectively. Radios, which functioned poorly in the best conditions, became even more unreliable in the extreme cold and moisture. Medical treatment of the wounded became a nightmare. Evacuation routes were clogged with traffic. Ambulances got stuck in snow. Field hospitals, overwhelmed with casualties, lacked adequate heating. Wounded. Soldiers suffered not just from their injuries, but from exposure to the cold. Frostbite became as serious a medical problem as gunshot wounds. Doctors worked in conditions that would have been unacceptable in any other circumstances, amputating frozen limbs, treating pneumonia, fighting infections with limited medicines. The cold affected equipment. Lubricants in vehicles froze, making engines hard to start and guns difficult to operate. Tank crews had to run their engines periodically through the night to prevent them from freezing. This consumed precious fuel and required crew members to remain on duty rather than sleeping. Weapons malfunctioned. The M1 Garand rifle, normally reliable, would jam if snow got into the action. Machine guns froze. Even small arms ammunition became problematic when moisture froze in cartridges. Soldiers improvised solutions. They wrapped weapons in cloth to keep snow out. They heated rations over small fires, though fires drew enemy attention. They shared body heat in foxholes, huddling together for warmth. They fashioned improvised winter camouflage from bedsheets or white parachutes. But nothing could fully compensate for the lack of proper winter equipment. Many American soldiers were still wearing the uniforms they had worn in summer. They lacked proper boots, gloves, or winter coats. Then, on December 23rd, the weather changed. And with it, the entire character of the battle. The clouds began to break up. By afternoon, patches of blue sky appeared. Meteorologists at Allied air bases confirmed what pilots could see with their own eyes. Conditions were improving. Within hours, aircraft that had sat idle for a week were being fueled, armed, and prepared for missions. What happened next was devastating for German forces. The full weight of Allied air power, which had been grounded for a week, descended on the Ardennes like a hammer. American P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs, along with British Typhoons, swept over the battlefield in massive formations. They hunted for German tanks and vehicles. When they found them, and they found them everywhere, they attacked with bombs, rockets, dunkits, and 50-caliber machine guns. The P-47, armed with 8 heavy machine guns and capable of carrying rockets or bombs, proved devastatingly effective against German armor. German soldiers, who had been moving freely for 7 days, suddenly found themselves targeted from above. Tank commanders who had ridden with hatches open now buttoned up, reducing their visibility and control. Supply columns that had traveled by day scrambled for cover. The psychological impact was immediate and crushing. German troops felt exposed, vulnerable, helpless. Heavy bombers joined the assault. B-17s and B-24s, normally reserved for strategic bombing deep in Germany, were diverted to tactical missions. They struck rail yards, supply depots, and road junctions behind German lines. One raid on Christmas Eve hit critical transportation nodes, creating traffic jams that paralyzed German logistics. Transport aircraft flew hundreds of sorties to Bastogne and other besieged positions. C-47s, unarmed and vulnerable, flew through anti-aircraft fire to drop supplies by parachute. On December 23rd alone, they flew 241 sorties, delivering over 144 tons of supplies. For the Germans, the return of Allied air power marked the effective end of any hope for success. Fuel convoys, already critically short, were destroyed before they could reach front-line units. Tanks ran out of gas and were abandoned. Reinforcements took heavy casualties moving forward. The offensive, which had already slowed due to American ground resistance, now ground to a halt. Hitler's entire plan had rested on poor weather continuing. Historical records show he deliberately chose the timing of the offensive to coincide with forecasts predicting overcast skies, and German meteorologists had projected that such conditions as would persist through late December. The forecast proved accurate for the first week, but weather, then as now, is unpredictable. When conditions changed on December 23rd, 3 days earlier than German weather services had predicted, the strategic calculation underlying the entire offensive collapsed. German commanders begged Hitler to authorize withdrawals from exposed positions. The offensive had clearly failed. Every hour that German forces remained in the salient cost lives and equipment for no gain. But Hitler refused. He insisted that German forces continue attacking, that they push on to Antwerp. This stubbornness doomed thousands of soldiers and ensured that when Germany finally did withdraw, it would do so in disorder, leaving behind vast amounts of irreplaceable equipment. The transformation, once the weather cleared, demonstrated a fundamental truth about modern warfare. Ground forces, no matter how skilled or determined, cannot succeed if the enemy controls the skies. The Battle of the Bulge showed that air superiority meant more than just shooting down enemy aircraft. It meant supporting friendly ground forces, interdicting enemy supply lines, and creating conditions where victory became inevitable rather than merely possible. For the American soldiers fighting in the snow, the sight of friendly aircraft overhead lifted morale immeasurably. They knew they were no longer alone, that help had arrived, that the balance had shifted. As one infantryman later recalled, When I saw those P-47s come over, I knew we were going to win. It was just a matter of time. The German high water mark and the beginning of the end. By December 24th, Christmas Eve, the German offensive had reached its maximum extent. The westernmost penetration came near the Belgian village of Foy-Notre-Dame, less than 4 miles from the Meuse River. Elements of the German 2nd Panzer Division reached this point, but they were at the end of their tether. They had no fuel to advance further. Behind them, American forces had cut their supply line. Ahead of them, British and American units were digging in along the Meuse. The 2nd Panzer Division's position at Foy-Notre-Dame represented the high water mark of Hitler's last gamble. From here, it was approximately 40 miles to Antwerp. The division had covered nearly 60 miles in 8 days, an impressive distance given the terrain, weather, and resistance. But those last 40 miles might as well have been 400. The division lacked fuel, ammunition, and supplies. It was isolated, surrounded, and facing destruction. On December 24th and 25th, British armoured units of the 29th Armoured Brigade attacked the German spearhead. The fighting was sharp and decisive. German tanks, immobilized by lack of fuel, were destroyed by British fire. German infantry, attempting to fight their way back to their own lines, were cut down or forced to surrender. By December 26th, the 2nd Panzer Division had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Out of approximately 2,500 men who had formed the spearhead, fewer than 600 escaped. Elsewhere along the front, similar patterns emerged. German units that had advanced rapidly in the first days of the offensive now found themselves overextended, undersupplied, and facing counterattacks from multiple directions. The 5th Panzer Army, which had made the deepest penetration, held a salient that was vulnerable from 3 sides. American forces held the northern shoulder around Elsenborn Ridge. They held Bastogne in the center. Patton's 3rd Army was attacking from the south. The German position was deteriorating by the hour. Fuel stocks, never adequate, were exhausted. Many tanks and vehicles were abandoned for lack of gasoline. Ammunition was running short. Food supplies were interrupted. Winter uniforms, like so many other supplies, had not reached frontline units. German soldiers suffered from cold, hunger, and exhaustion. Morale was cracking. The soldiers who had attacked on December 16th, believing they would win the war, now realized they were in a battle they could not win. The promised Luftwaffe support had not materialized. Allied aircraft controlled the skies. The promised resupply had not arrived. Roads were blocked or under fire. Officers who tried to rally their men for new attacks found soldiers who were exhausted, demoralized, and increasingly unwilling to continue fighting for a lost cause. Hitler, in his headquarters hundreds of miles from the front, refused to acknowledge reality. He insisted that the offensive continue. When Field Marshal Model requested permission to withdraw forces from exposed positions, Hitler denied it. When von Rundstedt suggested pulling back to more defensible lines to conserve forces for the coming Soviet offensive, Hitler ordered him to hold every inch of ground. This inflexibility doomed German forces to continue fighting in untenable positions, suffering casualties they could ill afford. On December 26th, several events marked the beginning of the German retreat, though Hitler would not authorize it for weeks. Patton's 4th Armored Division broke through to Bastogne, lifting the siege. The weather cleared completely, allowing Allied air forces to fly to Ackermann sorties. German units began pulling back without orders, local commanders making decisions to save their men despite Hitler's orders. The Christmas season, which should have brought a pause in fighting, saw some of the bloodiest combat of the entire battle. Both sides fought for villages, road junctions, and patches of frozen ground. The names of obscure Belgian and Luxembourg towns entered military history. Wiltz, Houffalize, Vielsalm, Mannheim. Each represented hours or days of combat. lives lost, units destroyed. German commanders, particularly von Manteuffel, tried to salvage what they could from the offensive. Von Manteuffel argued for limited objectives, for consolidating gains rather than continuing to attack. He proposed pulling back the most exposed units and establishing a more defensible line. But Hitler rejected these sensible suggestions. The Führer still believed that one more push, one more attack, might achieve the breakthrough that had eluded German forces. By early January 1945, even Hitler could not deny that the offensive had failed. German forces began a phased withdrawal, fighting rearguard actions to cover their retreat. American forces pursued, though cautiously. The terrain and weather still favored the defender. German units, even in retreat, could inflict casualties on advancing Americans. But the direction of the battle was no longer in doubt. The German High Command now faced a strategic disaster. The Ardennes offensive had consumed Germany's last strategic reserves. Panzer divisions that might have defended against the coming Soviet offensive in the east had been destroyed or crippled in the Ardennes. Fuel stocks that could have supported defensive operations were gone. The industrial capacity that might have produced replacements had been destroyed by Allied bombing or was about to be overrun. Hitler had gambled everything on the Ardennes offensive. He had believed that a dramatic victory in the West would force the Western Allies to negotiate, giving Germany time to deal with the Soviet threat. Instead, he had accomplished the opposite. He had weakened Germany's defenses at the precise moment when they needed to be strongest. He had given the Allies a victory that demonstrated German weakness rather than strength. He had hastened Germany's defeat. The Allied counteroffensive, closing the Bulge. While the German offensive had been characterized by rapid movement and dramatic advances, the Allied counteroffensive was methodical, coordinated, and relentless. Two main efforts would squeeze the Bulge from north and south, meeting at Houffalize to cut off German forces still in the salient. From the south, Patton's Third Army continued pushing north. The initial objective of relieving Bastogne had been achieved on December 26, but Patton was not content to stop there. He wanted to trap German forces in the Bulge, to cut off their retreat and destroy them completely. His divisions attacked despite bitter cold, heavy snow, and determined German resistance. The 4th Armored Division, which had spearheaded the relief of Bastogne, continued attacking north. Close behind came the 26th and 80th Infantry Divisions, securing ground the armor had taken and mopping up bypassed German positions. Additional divisions from the 3rd Army joined the attack: the 6th Armored, the 35th Infantry, the 87th Infantry. By early January, Patton had committed 9 divisions to the offensive. The fighting was brutal. German forces, even in retreat, fought skillfully. They used the terrain to their advantage, establishing defensive positions on high ground or in villages. They conducted counterattacks when American units became overextended. They laid mines and booby traps. Every mile gained cost casualties. Tank warfare in winter conditions tested crews and equipment. American Sherman tanks, designed for relatively open terrain, struggled in the forests and steep hills of the Ardennes. The German tanks, Panthers and Tigers, were technically superior but increasingly immobilized by lack of fuel. Battles were often fought at close range, with tanks engaging each other across streets or forest clearings. Infantry combat was equally difficult. Soldiers attacked across open, snow-covered fields, visible to defenders. German machine guns, positioned in buildings or tree lines, cut down advancing Americans. American infantry learned to advance only with heavy fire support, calling in artillery and mortars to suppress German positions before assaulting. The process was slow, methodical, and costly. From the north, Montgomery's counteroffensive began on January 3rd. British and American forces under Montgomery's command attacked southward toward Houffalize. The U.S. First Army, battered by the initial German assault, but now reinforced and reorganized, formed the main striking force. The British Wessex Corps provided support and reserve forces. Montgomery's attack was characteristically methodical. He insisted on thorough preparation, adequate supplies, and clear objectives. This caution frustrated American commanders who wanted rapid advances, but Montgomery's approach reflected his experience and determination to minimize casualties. His forces advanced steadily, if not spectacularly. The convergence of the two Allied offensives squeezed German forces in the Bulge. Units that had advanced boldly in December now had to fight their way back. The roads they had used to advance were now paths of retreat, and those roads were under constant Allied attack. German rear guards fought delaying actions to allow main force units to escape, sacrificing themselves to buy time. The weather continued to be a factor. January brought more snow and bitter cold. Soldiers on both sides suffered. Frostbite and trench foot reduced effective strength. Vehicles broke down or became stuck. Supply lines stretched thin, sometimes failed to deliver needed materials. But Allied logistics, backed by enormous industrial capacity and secure supply lines stretching back to ports, proved adequate. German logistics, always precarious, collapsed. On January the 16th, American forces from Patton's Third Army and American forces under Montgomery's command met at Houffalize. The meeting symbolically closed the Bulge. German forces that had not already retreated were now cut off or in danger of being cut off. Most German units had already withdrawn, but some still fought to escape the trap. The battle did not end at Houffalize. Fighting continued as Allied forces pushed east, driving German forces back to their start lines. Every village had to be cleared. Every German position had to be reduced. The process continued through the end of January. By January 20, 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was officially over. The front line had been restored to approximately where it had been on December 16th. German forces had withdrawn to their fortifications along the Siegfried Line. The bulge in the Allied lines had been eliminated. The Allied counteroffensive demonstrated several important military principles. First, the value of reserves. The rapid commitment of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, held in reserve behind the front, allowed Allied commanders to contain the German breakthrough. Second, the importance of logistics. Allied supply lines, though strained, delivered enough fuel, ammunition, and food to sustain offensive operations. German logistics failed completely. Third, the power of coordination. Despite personality conflicts and national tensions, Allied commanders coordinated their operations effectively. The battle also showed American military learning and adaptation. Units that had been surprised and nearly overrun in the opening days of the battle fought effectively in the counteroffensive. Junior officers and NCOs who had never led men in combat before demonstrated leadership under fire. The American military, which had been criticized for various failures earlier in the war, proved itself capable of recovering from disaster and winning decisive victory. The human cost. Soldiers, civilians, and winter's cruelty statistics tell part of the story of the Battle of the Bulge. American forces suffered approximately 81,000 casualties, including 19,000 killed, 47,500 wounded, and 23,000 missing or captured. German forces suffered between 80,000 and 100,000 casualties, including at least 20,000 killed. British forces suffered about 400 casualties. These numbers make the Battle of the Bulge the bloodiest single battle fought by the United States Army in World War II. But behind every statistic was a human being with a name, a family, a story. The Battle of the Bulge was fought by soldiers who were cold, hungry, frightened, and far from home. It was fought in conditions that tested human endurance to its limits. The human cost extended beyond casualties to include suffering that defied easy measurement. Consider the experience of a typical American infantryman during the battle. He wore a uniform designed for temperate weather, not the sub-zero temperatures of the Ardennes in winter. His boots, the standard-issue leather boots, were not waterproof. In snow and mud, they became wet. Wet feet in freezing temperatures led to trench foot, a painful and debilitating condition where tissue begins to die from lack of circulation. Thousands of American soldiers were evacuated with trench foot during the battle, often requiring amputation of toes or feet. Food during the battle consisted primarily of K rations, packaged meals designed for short-term use. Each K ration contained canned meat, crackers, candy, and a powdered drink mix. The rations were adequate for survival but provided little comfort or warmth. Soldiers tried to heat their rations over small fires, but fires attracted enemy attention. Many ate their food cold, struggling to open frozen cans with numb fingers. The winter conditions created challenges that went far beyond simple discomfort. Equipment that worked perfectly in normal conditions became unreliable or useless in the Ardennes cold. Tank crews discovered that their Sherman tanks, designed for the warmer climates of North Africa and France, were poorly insulated against freezing temperatures. The steel hulls conducted cold directly to the interior. Crews who touched metal surfaces with bare skin left pieces of flesh behind. They learned to wear gloves constantly, which made operating controls more difficult and slowed their reaction times in combat. Vehicle engines required constant attention. Mechanics worked around the clock trying to keep jeeps, trucks, and tanks operational. They learned to drain radiators each night to prevent the water from freezing and cracking engine blocks, then refill them in the morning, a time-consuming process that left vehicles vulnerable to surprise attacks during the hours they couldn't move. Batteries lost power in the cold, making it difficult to start engines. Fuel lines froze. Hydraulic systems seized up. What should have been simple maintenance became an exhausting daily battle against the elements. Weapons maintenance became a life-or-death concern. The Browning automatic rifle, a squad automatic weapon that provided critical fire support, was particularly prone to jamming in cold conditions. Soldiers learned to keep their BARs under their coats to maintain them at body temperature, even though this meant they couldn't bring the weapon into action quickly. Machine gun crews discovered that the lubricating oil they'd been issued would freeze solid, making the weapons useless. Some units resorted to using lighter oils, or even removing all lubrication entirely, accepting increased wear on the weapons as preferable to complete failure. Artillery crews faced their own challenges. The recoil mechanisms on howitzers used hydraulic fluid that became sluggish in extreme cold, affecting the weapon's accuracy and reliability. Frozen ground made it difficult to emplace artillery pieces properly, and the guns would shift after firing, requiring constant relaying. Ammunition itself was affected. Powder charges burned differently in cold temperatures, changing the projectile's range and trajectory. Forward observers had to calculate corrections for cold weather effects on top of all their other calculations, doing complex math in their heads while under fire and suffering from cold-induced mental sluggishness. The medical challenges were unprecedented in American military experience. Combat wounds that would have been survivable in warmer conditions became fatal in the Ardennes. Blood loss combined with exposure led to death from hypothermia before evacuation was possible. Medics discovered that plasma froze in its bottles and had to be thawed before use, costing precious minutes. Morphine syrettes, carried by every soldier for emergency pain relief, froze solid and couldn't be injected. Bandages froze to wounds, making removal agonizing. Medical supplies that required liquid form, iodine, antiseptics, anesthetics, became useless. Evacuation of the wounded became a nightmarish ordeal. Litter bearers struggled through deep snow carrying wounded men, often under fire. The wounded suffered terribly during transport, exposed to freezing temperatures for hours. Ambulances got stuck in snow or broke down from the cold. Field hospitals, set up in whatever buildings could be found, lacked adequate heating. Surgeons operated by lamplight in unheated barns and churches, their breath visible in the cold air, racing to complete operations before their patients died from exposure. Recovery wards were crowded with men suffering from both combat wounds and cold injuries, all competing for the limited warmth available. The constant danger of cold injury meant that commanders had to pull men out of the line regularly, not because they were casualties in the traditional sense, but because they were becoming hypothermic and could no longer function. This rotation requirement reduced the effective strength of units even when they hadn't been in combat. A company that started with 200 men might have only 120 capable of fighting at any given time, with the others warming themselves, treating cold injuries, or recovering from exposure. Communication systems, already stressed by the rapid German advance and the destruction of infrastructure, became even more unreliable in the cold. Radio batteries died quickly in freezing temperatures. Radio operators learned to keep batteries inside their clothing to preserve their charge, but this limited the number of batteries available. Wire communications were constantly disrupted, not just by artillery fire, which was expected, but by the simple weight of ice and snow on telephone lines, which caused them to snap. Signal companies spent as much time repairing lines broken by weather as by enemy action. Sleep was nearly impossible. Soldiers on the line spent nights in foxholes, shivering in the cold, trying to stay awake because falling asleep could mean freezing to death. Those fortunate enough to be in buildings or bunkers still struggled to stay warm. Frostbite claimed thousands of casualties. Soldiers wrapped themselves in whatever they could find: blankets, parachutes, enemy overcoats taken from prisoners or dead. But the experiences of individual soldiers reveal the true nature of survival in the Ardennes winter. Private James Sims of the 28th Infantry Division later described sleeping in a foxhole. You'd dig down as deep as you could, but the ground was frozen solid after about 6 inches. So you'd be in this shallow hole with snow piling up around you. You couldn't build it up with dirt because the dirt was frozen. You'd try to cover yourself with pine branches, anything. 2 men would huddle together for warmth, literally lying on top of each other. Every hour you'd switch positions so the guy on bottom, who got a little bit of warmth from the other guy and from the ground, would go on top. You'd set your watch and wake each other up, because if you didn't, the guy on top would freeze to death. Technical Sergeant Michael Dibert, a tank commander with the 4th Armored Division, recalled the challenges of operating armor in the cold. The inside of the tank was like a refrigerator. In summer, it had been like an oven. Now it was the opposite. We'd run the engine constantly when we could, but that used up fuel we needed for combat. When we had to shut down, the temperature inside would drop to match the outside within an hour. You'd touch any metal surface and your skin would stick to it. We wrapped everything in cloth, but you still had to operate the controls. I saw a loader lose the tip of his finger when it froze to a shell casing. Just snapped right off. We started wearing so many layers of clothing that we could barely move. You had to choose: be warm and slow, or be cold and combat ready. Usually, we chose cold. The psychological toll of the winter conditions compounded the stress of combat. Lieutenant Harold Beddoe, a platoon leader in the 99th Infantry Division, described the mental effects. After 3 or 4 days of constant cold, you stop thinking clearly. Your brain gets sluggish. Simple decisions become difficult. I remember trying to read a map, something I'd done thousands of times, and I couldn't make sense of it. The cold does something to your mind. You become obsessed with warmth. You start taking risks you wouldn't normally take, just to get near a fire or into a building. Men would expose themselves to enemy fire to retrieve a blanket from a dead soldier. The cold became more real, more immediate than the danger from bullets. Even rest areas behind the lines offered little relief. Sergeant Robert Henderson of the 101st Airborne, rotating out of Bastogne after the siege was lifted, described the experience. They pulled us back to what they called a rest area. It was just another frozen field with some tents. The tents had small stoves, but there wasn't enough fuel to keep them running all the time. You'd huddle around the stove when it was lit, and the moment it went out, the temperature would plunge. They gave us hot food, which was the first we'd had in days. But by the time you carried it from the mess tent to where you were sleeping, it was half frozen. They told us to clean our weapons, change our socks, get some sleep. But how do you sleep when you're shaking so hard your teeth are chattering? We were supposedly resting, but we were as cold there as we had been on the line. The only difference was nobody was shooting at us. Chaplain James O'Neill of the Third Army witnessed the spiritual impact of the winter battle. Men who hadn't prayed in years were praying in those foxholes. Not dramatic prayers, not eloquent prayers, just simple ones. God, let me live through this. God, let me see the sun. God, let me feel warm again. I held services in the open air in sub-zero temperatures. Men would come, maybe 20 or 30 of them, standing in the snow, their weapons ready in case of attack. We'd sing a hymn, their voices shaking from the cold. I'd say a few words, and then they'd go back to their positions. The cold made everything seem more final, more desperate. When a man died, he froze so quickly. There was something particularly awful about seeing a dead soldier frozen solid. It made death seem even more permanent, if that's possible. The psychological strain was immense. Soldiers watched friends killed or wounded. They lived under constant artillery fire. They faced enemy attacks, sometimes at night when visibility was limited to a few feet. They dealt with the fear that comes from being surrounded, cut off, or in danger of being overrun. Combat exhaustion, what we now call PTSD, affected many soldiers during and after the battle. Medical care under these conditions was rudimentary. Aid stations were set up in barns, churches, or cellars. Medics worked by candlelight or flashlight, performing surgery with limited supplies. The wounded suffered terribly. Transportation to rear area hospitals was difficult and slow. Men died from wounds that would have been survivable under better conditions. Others survived but carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Civilians in the Ardennes also suffered greatly during the battle. The region, which had been relatively quiet for months, suddenly became a war zone. Civilians found themselves caught between the armies. Some remained in their homes, sheltering in cellars as artillery shells fell and battles raged in the streets above them. Others became refugees, fleeing westward with whatever possessions they could carry. Belgian and Luxembourg civilians faced particular dangers. The Germans, retreating through the same towns they had occupied years before, sometimes took revenge on civilians suspected of helping the Allies. Villages were burned. Civilians were shot. Property was looted or destroyed. The civilian death toll from the battle has never been precisely calculated, but certainly numbered in the hundreds, possibly thousands. American prisoners of war also suffered. Thousands of Americans were captured during the battle, particularly in the first days when German advances overran American positions. These POWs endured harsh treatment. They marched east in the cold with little food or shelter. German guards, themselves cold and hungry, showed little mercy. Some American prisoners were shot when they could not keep up with the march. Others died from exposure or starvation in POW camps. The Malmedy massacre, discussed earlier, was the most infamous atrocity of the battle. but it was not an isolated incident. Kampfgruppe Peiper committed other killings of prisoners and civilians at Honsfeld, Bullingen, Ligneville, Stavelot, and other locations. In total, Peiper's unit is believed to have killed approximately 350 American POWs and 100 Belgian civilians. These war crimes would lead to trials after the war, with 73 SS members eventually convicted, though controversy over the trial's conduct would follow. But American forces also committed atrocities. The Malmedy massacre so enraged American soldiers that some units adopted a no-prisoners policy. At Chinon, Belgium, on January 1, 1945, American soldiers from the 11th Armored Division murdered approximately 60 German POWs. This and other smaller incidents of prisoner killing represented a breakdown of military discipline and a stain on American conduct of the war. The German soldiers fighting in the Ardennes also suffered terribly. Many were young men, sometimes teenagers, who had been drafted late in the war. They wore thin uniforms, inadequate for the cold. They lacked adequate food and medical care. They fought for a cause that many no longer believed in, following orders from commanders who increasingly seemed detached from reality. German wounded often received no medical care. German units, lacking transport, sometimes left their wounded behind when they retreated. The Battle of the Bulge produced countless stories of individual courage and sacrifice. Medics who ran through fire to treat wounded. Junior officers who led charges against enemy positions. Soldiers who held their posts against overwhelming odds. Civilians who sheltered wounded soldiers. Chaplains who comforted the dying. Each of these stories deserves to be remembered. One such story involves Private First Class Francis Curry of the 120th Infantry Regiment. On December 21st, near Malmedy, Curry's unit came under attack by German armor and infantry. Curry, armed with a Browning automatic rifle, left his defensive position and engaged a German tank with a bazooka, destroying it. He then attacked a German position with hand grenades, causing the surrender of several enemy soldiers. Throughout the day, despite being wounded, Curry continued to fight, destroying another enemy tank and leading counterattacks. For his actions, he received the Medal of Honor. 21 Medals of Honor, America's highest military decoration, were awarded for actions during the Battle of the Bulge. Each represents extraordinary valor in the face of extreme danger. But thousands of other acts of courage went unrecognized except by those who witnessed them. The Battle of the Bulge was, above all, a soldier's battle, won by the courage and determination of individuals who did their duty under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. Aftermath and legacy. Hitler's final defeat. When the Battle of the Bulge ended in late January 1945, the landscape told the story of destruction. The Ardennes Forest was scarred with shell craters, fallen trees, and the wreckage of war. Villages lay in ruins, their inhabitants beginning the slow process of rebuilding. Roads were clogged with destroyed vehicles. Scattered across the snow were the bodies of soldiers from both sides, frozen in their final moments. The human and material losses were staggering. For the United States, preliminary Army reports cited approximately 75,000 to 81,000 battle casualties, including at least 8,600 killed. Some estimates suggest closer to 19,000 when including those who died of wounds or went missing and were later confirmed dead, approximately 47,000 wounded, and around 23,000 missing or captured. This made it the single bloodiest engagement American forces fought in World War II. Entire divisions had been shattered. Replacements would be needed to bring units back to strength. Equipment losses included hundreds of tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces, though these could be replaced from America's vast industrial capacity. Germany's losses were equally severe, but far more difficult to replace. between 80,000 and 100,000 German casualties represented soldiers Germany could not replace. The panzer divisions that had spearheaded the offensive were destroyed or crippled. Approximately 600 tanks and assault guns were lost, along with hundreds of aircraft. Fuel stocks that might have sustained defensive operations were exhausted. The strategic reserve that might have defended against the Soviet winter offensive was gone. Perhaps most importantly, the Battle of the Bulge had consumed time. The 6 weeks of fighting delayed Allied offensives into Germany, but it also delayed Germany's preparation for the Soviet offensive that everyone knew was coming. In January 1945, while the Battle of the Bulge was still being fought, Soviet forces launched their winter offensive on the Eastern Front. German forces, weakened by the transfer of divisions to the Ardennes and lacking reserves to stop the Soviet advance, crumbled. By February, Soviet Artyom forces were approaching Berlin. For Hitler, the failure of the Ardennes offensive marked the definitive end of any hope for German victory. He had gambled everything on this one roll of the dice. He had believed that a dramatic victory would force the Western Allies to negotiate, that it would buy time to defeat the Soviets, that it would prove Germany could still win. Instead, the offensive had accomplished the opposite. It had demonstrated German weakness, wasted resources, and hastened defeat. After the battle, Hitler's behavior suggests he became increasingly detached from reality. He issued orders for offensives that his remaining forces could not execute. He demanded that depleted or destroyed units launch attacks. He refused to authorize even clearly necessary retreats. Based on accounts from those present, the final months of the war saw Hitler in his Berlin bunker, surrounded by those unwilling to challenge his directives, issuing orders that bore little connection to actual military capabilities. For the Allies, the Battle of the Bulge represented both a shock and a triumph. The shock came from realizing that Germany, which had seemed on the verge of collapse, could still mount a major offensive. Allied intelligence had failed to detect German preparations. Allied commanders had underestimated German capabilities. These failures led to reforms in intelligence gathering and analysis, ensuring that such surprises would be less likely in the future. But the triumph was equally significant. When surprised and initially defeated, Allied forces had recovered. They had contained the German breakthrough, brought up reinforcements, and launched counteroffensives that not only eliminated the Bulge, but destroyed German forces in the process. The American army, which had been criticized for various failings earlier in the war, had proven itself capable of winning a major battle against Germany's best remaining forces. The battle also demonstrated the superiority of Allied logistics, coordination, and air power. German forces, even when fighting well tactically, could not overcome Allied material advantages. The American industrial base, churning out tanks, trucks, aircraft, and supplies, ensured that losses could be replaced quickly. German industry, devastated by bombing and lacking raw materials, could not match this production. Individual commanders emerged from the battle with enhanced or diminished reputations. Patton's rapid pivot and relief of Bastogne became legendary. McAuliffe's nuts reply entered American popular culture. Eisenhower's calm management of the crisis demonstrated his qualities as a coalition commander. Montgomery, despite his tactical competence, earned criticism for his cautious approach and his controversial press conference where he seemed to take credit for an American victory. For the soldiers who fought in the battle, the experience left lasting marks. Many suffered from what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. They had nightmares about the cold, the snow, the sounds of battle. They grieved for lost friends, but they also felt pride in what they had accomplished. They had faced one of history's great armies under terrible conditions and had prevailed. As one veteran later wrote, We were cold, scared, and far from home, but we were Americans, and we did our job. The Battle of the Bulge accelerated Germany's defeat. By early April 1945, American and British forces had crossed the Rhine and were driving deep into Germany. Soviet forces were besieging Berlin. On April 30th, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. On May the 7th, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. In the decades since the battle, its importance has been debated by historians. Some argue that it was a minor delay, that Germany's defeat was inevitable regardless of the Ardennes offensive. Others contend that it was decisive, that it destroyed Germany's last reserves and made rapid Allied victory possible. The truth likely lies somewhere between these extremes. The Battle of the Bulge did not change the war's ultimate outcome, but it did affect the timeline and the manner of Germany's defeat. But here's what often gets overlooked in those historical debates. And here's the twist that reframes everything you've just learned. The Battle of the Bulge wasn't won by heroism alone, though there was plenty of that. It wasn't won by superior firepower, though that mattered. It was won by preparation that nobody recognized as preparation at the time. Remember that opening scene? December 16th, 5:24 a.m., 6 minutes before the artillery barrage? The Americans seemed doomed, completely surprised, facing annihilation. But look closer at what was already in place. First, on December 9th, Colonel Oskar Koch briefed General Patton on German troop concentrations opposite the Ardennes and warned that an offensive was possible. Patton, and this is crucial, actually listened. He ordered his staff to prepare contingency plans for pivoting north. When the crisis came, those plans existed. That's why Patton could move 3 divisions in 72 hours when everyone else thought it impossible. Second, the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were positioned at Camp Mourmelon, near Reims, perfectly positioned to respond to a breakthrough anywhere on the front. This wasn't luck. Eisenhower had deliberately kept these elite divisions in reserve rather than committing them to the grinding offensives elsewhere. When the crisis came, they could move immediately. Third, the thin American line in the Ardennes wasn't a mistake. It was a calculated risk. Bradley had consciously stripped that sector to concentrate forces for offensives elsewhere. But the units he left there, the 2nd Infantry Division at Elsenborn Ridge, scattered elements around Saint-Vith and Bastogne, were positioned at the exact critical road junctions that would determine the battle's outcome. American commanders had learned from earlier battles. When the 99th Infantry Division was hit at Elsenborn Ridge, junior officers didn't panic. They'd been trained in flexible defense. When surrounded at Bastogne, the 101st didn't consider surrender because they'd fought surrounded before in Normandy. The American Army of December 1944 was not the army that had landed at Normandy. It had been bloodied, yes, but also hardened and educated by 6 months of combat. Fifth, the decision to defend rather than immediately counterattack. When the German offensive began, Eisenhower's first instinct wasn't to counterattack everywhere. It was to hold the shoulders, deny the Germans the roads they needed, and let them extend into a salient that could be cut off. This wasn't panic. It was doctrine. Now here's where it gets remarkable. None of these decisions were made because anyone predicted the Battle of the Bulge. Koch's briefing was one of dozens of intelligence reports. The airborne divisions were held in reserve for many possible contingencies. Bradley's calculated risk in the Ardennes was about allocating limited forces. The flexible defense doctrine was taught because it made sense, not because anyone knew it would be tested in a winter forest. These were small decisions, reasonable decisions, professional decisions made by competent commanders doing their jobs. But together, They created a situation where, when the unexpected happened, the American army could respond. The Germans saw this as luck. They complained after the war that if only the weather had stayed bad longer, if only they'd broken through at Elsenborn Ridge, if only the Americans hadn't moved so quickly to defend Bastogne. But it wasn't luck. It was preparation meeting opportunity. It was the difference between an army that improvised because it had trained to improvise and an army that followed a rigid plan because its dictator would accept no alternatives. Hitler's plan required everything to go perfectly. The Americans' response worked because they'd prepared for things to go wrong. Today, the Ardennes region preserves memories of the battle. Museums in Bastogne and other towns display artifacts and tell the story. Cemeteries hold the remains of thousands of soldiers who died in the snow. Monuments mark where units fought and where heroes fell. Veterans, now elderly, occasionally return to walk the ground where they fought so long ago. The lessons of the Battle of the Bulge remain relevant. It teaches the danger of intelligence failures and the importance of maintaining adequate reserves. It demonstrates that even a seemingly defeated enemy can be dangerous if underestimated. It shows that courage, leadership, and determination can overcome initial setbacks. And it reminds us that freedom is not free, that it must be defended, sometimes at terrible cost by those willing to sacrifice for it. Hitler called the Ardennes offensive Germany's last gamble. Sir was right, but not in the way he intended. It was a gamble that Germany could not afford to take and could not win. When it failed, Germany's fate was sealed. But here's the final truth about the Battle of the Bulge, the thing that makes it remarkable in military history. It was won before the first shot was fired. Not because the Allies had superior numbers. They didn't. Not at first. Not because American soldiers were better trained or better equipped. Many weren't. It was won because of something subtler and more profound. It was won because one colonel in Patton's Third Army paid attention to intelligence others dismissed. It was won because junior officers at Elsenborn Ridge refused to panic when attacked. It was won because a general besieged at Bastogne had the presence of mind to make a joke when offered surrender terms. It was won because tank crews at St. Vith fought delaying actions that bought time measured in hours but proved decisive. It was won because hundreds of individual soldiers, whose names we'll never know, made the decision to hold their ground when everything in their training and instinct told them to run. The Germans believed they could replicate 1940, that one bold stroke could change the war's trajectory. But they failed to understand something fundamental. The American army of December 1944 was not the French army of May 1940. These were soldiers who had learned from earlier mistakes, who had been bloodied and had survived, who knew they were part of something larger than themselves. When hit by overwhelming force, they didn't collapse. They bent, they pulled back where necessary, but they didn't break. And then, incredibly, they counterattacked. That's the real story of the Battle of the Bulge. Not just that the Americans won, but how they won. By refusing to accept defeat when defeat seemed inevitable. By turning the enemy's moment of triumph into a trap. By making Hitler's last gamble into his final fatal mistake. Remember those American soldiers sleeping in their foxholes on December 16th at 5:24 a.m.? 6 minutes before the artillery barrage that would begin the battle? They seemed doomed, caught completely by surprise, facing annihilation from an enemy force that outnumbered them more than 2-1. But in that moment, though none of them knew it, the outcome was already determined. Not by fate, not by luck, but by a series of small, professional decisions made by competent officers in the weeks before. Koch's briefing, Patton's contingency planning, Eisenhower's decision to keep the airborne divisions in reserve, Bradley's calculated risk in the Ardennes, the training in flexible defense, the positioning of critical units at key road junctions. Those sleeping soldiers were not doomed. They were prepared, though they didn't know it. When the artillery barrage came, when the German infantry advanced, when tanks broke through their lines, they would bend but not break. They would retreat when necessary, but hold when critical. They would improvise, adapt, and overcome not through superhuman courage, though there was plenty of that, but because their army had prepared them to do exactly that. The Battle of the Bulge was truly Hitler's last gamble and his final defeat. But it was also something more. Proof that the outcome of battles is determined not just by numbers and firepower, but by the will to resist, the courage to endure, and, perhaps most importantly, by the 1,000 small decisions made in peacetime and in war that prepare an army to meet the unexpected. And sometimes, just sometimes, by the wisdom to know that when surrounded, outnumbered, and offered terms of surrender, the only appropriate response is simply nuts. Thanks for listening to Sleepable History. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Battle of the Bulge, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting that like button. It really helps us bring you more stories from history. Sleep well, and remember, even in our darkest hours, courage and determination can change the course of history.